Imagine an ordinary day at the ATM, when a 79-year-old man withdraws money, and suddenly something he clearly did not expect happens. He is attacked by a robber, but this criminal did not even guess who he would actually have to deal with. It turns out that age is not always an indicator of weakness. The story takes an unexpected turn, and today you will find out how this old man was able to fight back. Before we continue, write in the comments where you are watching this video from. It would be interesting to know where else such unusual stories happen. A man stood at an ATM on a quiet street corner, lost in his thoughts, when a stranger appeared from behind him. He had a knife in his hands and a predatory glint in his eyes. At first glance, this situation might seem tragic. An elderly, seemingly defenseless man and a young, dangerous criminal. But appearances can often be deceiving, and the criminal had no idea that this 79-year-old man was more than just a pensioner. His name was John, and John was a veteran. His body might be aging, but his mind was as sharp as the blade he had held so many years ago. But it wasn't just about physical fitness or military skills. From an early age, John had to learn to survive in a harsh world where black people had to fight for a place in the sun. Throughout his long and difficult life, John has faced racism and injustice. As a black man in mid-20th century America, he lived through horrific times of segregation and discrimination. As a young boy, he watched as people like him were scorned and abused simply because of the color of their skin. He had to hide from crowds that considered him an enemy simply because he was born different. A Vietnam veteran, he had to face death more than once, both in the war and at home, in a country where racial prejudice was still an integral part of life. And so, after years of struggle, John found himself once again on the brink of danger. But this time the threat was not only the knife the criminal held in his hand, but also the old shadow of racism. The young robber, standing in front of John, believed that he was just an old man, a black old man who would easily succumb to threats. This internal prejudice was reinforced by years of social inequality. The robber thought that force was his weapon. He saw John not as a person, but as a victim, a stereotype that was ingrained in his mind. But he was wrong. John looked at his opponent with cold calm. His eyes had already seen things worse than that knife. Glinting in the street light, he had no intention of running or retreating. The veteran silently assessed the distance, the angle of attack, the position of the robber's hands. When the man took the first step, John reacted with lightning speed. A sharp turn, and the criminal's hand was under John's control. This blow was not aggressive or rough, rather precise and verified, like a lesson from the past, which he had so often practiced in hot spots. The knife fell from the criminal's hand. His surprise was replaced by panic. But it wasn't the physical superiority that was at issue. What struck the young burglar most was the confidence and determination with which John had acted. He realized that he hadn't simply attacked an older man. He had been up against something much more complex and profound. His attack was reminiscent of all the times in John's life when people had tried to suppress him simply because of the color of his skin, when they had thought he was weak or undeserving of respect. And each time, John had proven them wrong. This situation was just another example of the reality that John had faced throughout his life. Even at 79, he had to contend not only with physical threats, but also with the ghosts of racism that remain in society. The robber thought he could intimidate and deceive him based on old stereotypes, but he came across a man who had long ago outgrown these prejudices and learned to protect himself not only with force, but also with intelligence, fortitude, and experience. As the gunman lay on the ground, dazed and disoriented, John looked at him with quiet sadness. This young man was a product of the same systemic injustices that had shaped his own life. The robber may never have realized that he was a victim of the same racial stereotypes and social inequalities that drove people to crime out of desperation and hopelessness. But John knew it all too well. For John, this moment was symbolic of the struggle he had been waging all his life. He did not continue the fight or punish the criminal. He simply walked away, allowing the young man to realize the error of his ways. John knew that he had won more than just physically. His victory was in preserving his humanity and dignity in the face of cruelty and ignorance. And this episode at the ATM, which could have ended in tragedy, became yet another testimony to the strength of spirit that, despite age and race, overcomes any difficulties. As John walked away from the mugger, leaving him stunned on the ground, he felt a wave of mixed emotions. On the one hand, there was the familiar satisfaction of having stood up for himself without giving in to fear or despair. On the other, there was the sinking feeling of weariness from everything that had happened in his life. It seemed as if the world had changed little in the years since then, and the struggles he had faced in his youth were still a thing of the past. The past still haunted John. He remembered how he had been stopped on the street for no reason as a young man, how his peers had been abused by police officers, and how his entire life had been marked by the struggle to simply exist, to work, to live like everyone else. How many times had he felt ignored, that his opinions didn't matter, that his problems were foreign to most of the people around him. But John had always been a fighter. He hadn't let the system break him, not when his youth had been spent under the weight of discrimination, and not now, when the years had given him wisdom and patience. The mugger who had tried to rob him today wasn't just a criminal, he was a symbol of an entire generation trapped by inequality and stereotypes. John could see in him a reflection of his own youth, only disfigured by different conditions. This young man may not have realized the depth of his actions. He may have grown up poor, surrounded by violence, where the streets dictated their own rules, but John also knew that was no excuse for this behavior. Over his long life, he had encountered many people who used their situation as an excuse for cruelty. He had learned one thing: we all make choices. And today, he showed this boy that it was possible to make different choices. When John looked back to see the robber slowly rising from the ground, he saw in his eyes not only fear, but also confusion. The young man looked at John as if for the first time he saw in him not just an old man, not just a black man, but a man strong, proud, self-confident. Suddenly John remembered the conversations his father had had with him when they had sat on the porch in his early childhood. "Always hold your head up high," his father had said. "It doesn't matter what they think of you. It matters what you think of yourself." Those words had followed John throughout his life, and in that moment he felt their power as never before. He knew he couldn't change the world with one action, but he could change the perception of at least one person. "I've known your kind," John finally said, standing in front of the young man, who was still clutching his sides from the blow. "Guys who think the world owes them something, that violence is the only way to get respect. But you're on the wrong track." The young man was silent, looking at John. It was probably the first time anyone had spoken to him in that tone, not as a criminal, but as a person whose life mattered. "You think I'm just an old man, that I don't know what you're going through," John continued, "but I've seen it. I've been there. The difference is, I chose a different path. And if you knew even a little bit about what I've been through, you'd realize you're not the first person who thought he could attack me." John paused, letting the young man's words sink in. This moment was not meant to humiliate or intimidate the criminal, but to give him a chance to reflect on his life, on where his actions were leading him. John saw the same potential in this boy that he had seen in his brothers in arms when he was at war, or in those young men who had to fight for a place in the sun in America. "You can take something from this," John added, leaning slightly toward the young man, "or you can continue to live as you do. But know this, sooner or later, you will have to face reality. And believe me, reality hurts more than you think." The young man, still stunned and perhaps realizing for the first time that his world was not limited to violence and crime, nodded silently. John, realizing that this conversation no longer needed to be continued, turned and went his way. He did not look back, because he knew that he had nothing left to prove. He had spent his entire life proving his strength and resilience in the face of injustice and cruelty, and today was no exception. For John, it was another victory, not over the robber, but over the circumstances that had tried to break him throughout his life. John walked down the dark street, his steps heavy, his mind racing with what had just happened. He knew he had made the right choice, but something in his soul was nagging at him. That young robber. John felt like he saw more than just fear in his eyes, desperation, maybe even regret. Maybe this guy hadn't wanted this life, but circumstances had pushed him down a dark path. John's house was already visible in the distance, his quiet, cozy corner where he could rest from the storms of life. But as he approached it, memories began to overwhelm him. Pictures from the past floated before his eyes, and his steps slowed under the weight of memories. One episode in particular stood out to him: 1965. At the height of the civil rights movement, as a young man, John had marched on Selma, one of those historic marches that forever changed the face of America. He remembered standing at the front of the line, shoulder to shoulder with other black men and women, holding signs demanding equality. He remembered the police coming, and how the peaceful protest turned to chaos. That day, for the first time, he saw how violent the world could be. They weren't just dispersing the crowd with batons and tear gas. No, their blows weren't just painful, they were symbols of centuries of hatred, deeply rooted in society. John was thrown to the ground, and despite his physical abilities, he felt helpless in the face of this merciless oppression. Then, in that moment, he decided he would never be a victim again. He survived, but the scars remained, not on his body, but in his soul. Those memories haunted him for the rest of his life. He realized that his fight for equality and justice had not ended back then. In the 1960s, it was still there. In every step he took, in every look he received on the street, he lived in a country that had seemingly become freer, but was still deeply divided. And this young man at the ATM, John saw more than just a criminal. He saw a generation that was being subjected to the same injustices that John had endured, over and over again, and that they might no longer be able to tolerate. As John walked up to his house, his legs suddenly felt weak. He leaned against the fence, his breathing heavy. Age was beginning to catch up with him. The pain in his chest was getting worse, and he had to sit down on the steps. Moments of weakness had been coming to him more and more often in recent years, but this one was especially strong. He closed his eyes and tried to calm down, but instead he saw scenes from the past again: the march, the police, the violence, the blood on the pavement. He opened his eyes and saw the sky dark, starless, empty. It reminded him of those long nights in Vietnam, when as a young soldier he had looked up at the sky, wondering why the world was so cruel. The war had seemed pointless then, but he had done his duty, believing he was defending freedom. But when he returned home, John realized that the real war was not on the fields of Vietnam, but on the streets of America, a fight for equal rights, for basic human dignity. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. Someone was approaching. John tensed, instinctively preparing for possible danger, but to his surprise, it was the same young man he had just left lying by the ATM. John slowly rose to his feet, his heart clenching with tension. The young man came closer, but this time there was no aggression in his eyes. On the contrary, they were filled with a mixture of guilt and embarrassment. He stopped at a distance, as if he did not dare to come closer. I don't know what to say, the young man began, his voice shaking. I wanted to apologize. I didn't think things would turn out like this. John looked at him carefully, his face stone-faced, but emotions boiling inside him. He saw before him not just a young man, he saw a broken life, a man cornered by circumstances. You have nothing to apologize for, John said slowly. The world you live in made you this way, but you're still responsible for your actions. I could have died there at the ATM. Your life would have been ruined, just like mine. The young man looked down and his shoulders slumped. I didn't want this. I just needed the money. My sister is in trouble. I thought it was the only way out. His voice became quieter. But when you managed to stop me, I realized that I was wrong. You are different. I'm not different, John said, softening his tone. I'm just like you. This whole world was breaking me, just like it's breaking you, but I made a choice not to let it win. The young man looked at John, and hope appeared in his eyes, as if he were hearing for the first time the words that could change his life. This conversation was more than just an exchange of lines. It was a clash of two generations, two destinies, connected by the same struggle, but separated by time. What now? The young man asked quietly. What should I do? John looked at him for a long time before answering. Live in a way that you are not ashamed of. It will be difficult for you. The world will not change overnight, but you can change if you decide that you want to. And remember, you can always make a choice, even when it seems that there is no way out. The young man nodded, as if the words had given him new purpose. He turned and walked away, leaving John on the dark street. John watched him go, feeling that perhaps for the first time in a long time, he had done more than just protect himself. He had given this boy a chance that had been taken away from so many. The night was quiet, and in that quiet John felt the peace he seemed to have been searching for so long. A quiet in which there was no violence, no fear, no racial hatred. For the first time in years, he felt that this struggle had meaning after all. John stood outside for a long time, watching the young man disappear into the night. Hundreds of thoughts were spinning in his head, but his heart was still beating with alarm. These few minutes between life and death reminded him how fragile the reality we live in is. And although John looked calm on the outside, a storm was still raging inside. He couldn't just leave everything that had happened. When John finally entered the house and locked the door behind him, he was overcome by a deep weariness. He sat down on the old leather sofa, which he remembered several decades of life, and exhaled heavily. The figure of that guy was still before his eyes, young, confused in his own life. At some point, John even began to doubt whether he had done the right thing. Maybe he should have called the police. Maybe this guy would continue to rob. Maybe even kill someone if he was unlucky next time. But something in his eyes, this difficult but understandable despair, did not give John peace. John knew that his actions were more than just a confrontation with a criminal, but something bigger, a struggle that had lasted for decades. This wasn't just an encounter on a dark street. This was a collision of two lives, two stories, both woven with threads of racial injustice. John remembered the days when, as a young man, he had taken to the streets with other black people to protest segregation and injustice. Back then, the police, like predators, had attacked them as soon as they tried to defend their right to equality. Young John had been beaten within an inch of his life several times, thrown into jail, tear-gassed, and water cannons had been used to disperse crowds. He knew what it was like to be broken by the system, but he knew even more what it was like to survive and preserve himself. After one of these protests, when he, young and half-dead, was thrown into a prison cell for several days, John understood an important thing. Even when it seems that you have been deprived of everything, something important always remains inside you, your will. And this will was stronger than any fist, any club, any unfair system. He made a promise to himself then. He would never allow fear and anger to destroy his soul. And this will carry him through many trials, the war, the years of fighting for rights, long nights in prison, when he was accused simply of being in the wrong part of town. But not everyone around him could bear this burden. His friends, relatives, acquaintances, many could not stand it and died, either physically or mentally broken under the pressure of the system. John learned to balance on the fine line between anger and survival, not allowing hatred to consume his heart. But one thought kept nagging at him. This young man, the one standing in front of him at the ATM with a knife in his hand, was not the first and most likely not the last. John remembered many such young men, lost in their own pain and anger, rejected by society, pushing them into the arms of crime. He saw how easy it was to end up in their place. He himself could have become one of them, if not for a few chance encounters in his life, a few of the right people who were there at the right time. John had seen this cycle all his life: poverty, destruction, despair, crime, but he knew the problem was deeper. Racism wasn't just prejudice or hatred from one person to another. It was a system that had been ingrained into society for centuries, making the poor and weak even poorer and weaker. It gave no chance of escape. It continually pushed them down. It took away the future of young black men and women, as if fate itself were stacked against them. As a child, John watched his father, a strong, proud man, come home exhausted from working 14 hours in the fields and still barely being able to feed the family. He watched his mother struggle to keep the house clean, cook, and care for the children, even though she herself sometimes went hungry. It wasn't just poverty, it was the knowledge that you worked harder than anyone else and were paid less than anyone else, because you were black. When John was a kid, he didn't understand why their house was smaller than the white neighbors, why his school didn't have proper textbooks, and why teachers threatened and bullied him every day. But as he grew older, he realized that this wasn't an accident, but a systemic phenomenon. They weren't supposed to succeed, they weren't given a chance, and every one of his friends who tried to break out of that cage found themselves being pulled back. as if chains of an invisible force were shackles around their freedom. Over and over again, John understood all too well what had happened to the young man at the ATM. Perhaps he had grown up in a similar neighborhood, where crime was the only way to survive. Perhaps his own family had suffered from poverty, and he had been taught from a young age that he was not worthy of more. The system had squeezed him from all sides, forcing him to make the wrong choices. But even so, John knew that there was no excuse for crime. Everyone has a choice. John suddenly remembered his nephew James. He was a young and promising guy who wanted to go to college and become a doctor. But life in a poor area, constant pressure and fear of the future made James take the wrong turn. One day, he ended up in prison for being involved in a fight. John tried to help him, pull him out, put him back on the right path, but the system was stronger. When James was released, he was no longer the guy with dreams of medical school. He was broken, his confidence was destroyed, and his faith in justice evaporated. 2 years later, James was found dead on the street, shot in a gang shootout. John never forgave himself for failing to protect him. It was the first time he felt that the system he had spent his life fighting had defeated him, taking away one of the people he loved most. Now, sitting on his old couch, John felt the weight of memories squeeze his chest. He had lost so many people on this road of struggle that sometimes it seemed as if there was no point in it anymore. But today's encounter with the young robber reminded him again that the fight goes on. John knew that if he simply walked away now, if he did nothing, the world would not change. Young black men would continue to survive, not live, facing the same problems he had faced all those years ago. The next day, John couldn't just let it go. He decided to track down the young man. John knew it might seem strange, but he felt he had to try to make a difference, even if it was just in one person's life. He might not be able to change the entire system, but if he could give this guy a chance at a different path, a life outside of crime, that would be a victory. He wasn't naive. John knew that such decisions weren't made overnight, that fixing a person's life was a difficult task. But after all he'd been through, after all the sacrifices and losses, he knew one thing: silence and inaction were the path to defeat. John walked out into the street, determined to find the boy and talk to him. His own past was surfacing again, mixing with the present, and he knew it was time to act. Time to give at least one person a chance, because behind each of them there was a generation waiting for change. The fight continued. John spent several days thinking, his determination to find the young burglar becoming more and more obsessive. He knew this meeting was no accident. He couldn't just leave it as it was. His inner world was seething, mixing anger at the system that continued to break young lives with the hope that maybe at least one person could escape this vicious circle. He had already lost James, and this new guy had become a symbol for John, a symbol of all those who were forgotten, abandoned, and unheard. One morning, after much thought, he decided to go to the place where the attack had taken place. He thought that perhaps he would meet someone there who knew the young robber. The area was old, but still vibrant. Its streets seemed to breathe life despite all the difficulties. John felt like an outsider in this world, although, in fact, he himself had grown up in the same conditions. But much had changed. The poverty was the same, but now it was saturated with drugs, violence, and absolute hopelessness. He walked down the street, watching the people around him. On the corner of a building stood a group of young men, looking around nervously. John guessed that they were involved in drugs. He had seen such scenes too many times, but he walked past, trying not to attract unnecessary attention to himself. Walking up to the same ATM where they had met, John stopped. The place seemed the same as it had that night, dark, cluttered. He ran his hand over his face, trying to calm his tense thoughts. "What am I doing?" flashed through his mind, but he had come too far to back out. "Hey, old man!" someone shouted behind him. John turned around abruptly. The same young man stood before him. This time he looked a little different. His clothes were the same, but his face expressed less aggression, but rather confusion. The guy recognized John immediately, but instead of fear, there was a mixture of curiosity and incomprehension in his eyes. "You're here?" he began, a note of bewilderment in his voice. "I thought that after what happened, you wouldn't want to come back." John straightened up calmly and answered, trying not to show his emotions. "I'm not one to run away. and I can't just leave you like this. What are you doing here? Boy, do you want to rob someone again? The young man frowned and looked down, as if considering John's words. This time his expression was completely different. John felt that the guy he had met that night and this one were two different people. I don't know, he finally answered, rubbing his hands awkwardly. It was a mistake. I didn't mean for it to turn out this way. I just didn't know what to do. I had no choice. John was silent, letting the boy speak. He felt that it was important for him not to lecture, but just to listen. My sister is sick, the young man continued. She has cancer, and I can't afford the treatment. I've tried working, but it's not the same. I've lost jobs one after another. In our neighborhood, none of us are given a chance. People like us, no one needs us. Have you seen? Everyone here lives like that. I don't want to be like that, but, damn, I'm left with no choice. John stared at him for a long moment, listening to the same note of desperation in his voice that he had heard in James all those years ago. He knew that this young man's words were not an excuse. It was the truth for many young black men in America. The system did not give them a chance to escape. It was a sense of hopelessness that gnawed at them from the inside. I know how you feel, John finally said. I've been there. Many of my friends have. We've all been there. But you know what I've learned? That the system will always try to destroy you if you give it a chance. But the choice is always yours. The young man chuckled in disbelief. Choice? What choice do I have? Work for pennies or die of hunger? There's always a choice, John said quietly but confidently, even when it seems like there isn't one. I lost my nephew. He was just like you, wanted more, but didn't know how to get it. In the end, he followed the same path as you and died. That's not the answer. You can be better than this. The boy was silent. His eyes seemed to wander through memories, as if he was trying to see some spark of hope in John's words. Did you come here for me? He asked after a long pause. Yes, John answered honestly. I don't know if I can help you, but I'll at least try. Too many young people like you end up in prison or dead. I've lost enough people close to me. I can't just watch another life be ruined. The young man looked at John with distrust, but signs of hope began to appear in his eyes. He was not used to anyone extending a helping hand to him, especially someone like John, an old, strong and wise man who had been through fire and water. What do you suggest? He finally asked, trying not to show that he was offended by John's proposal. Let's start with you stopping thinking of yourself as a victim. You are strong. I've seen it, but your strength should work for you, not against you. There are options, even if they seem impossible. Work, education, we can find a way out. You still have a chance. The young man glanced around nervously, as if considering his options, but then his face relaxed a little, and for the first time in a long time he looked at John with gratitude. It sounds strange, but I'm willing to try, he said quietly. Maybe I still have a chance. John nodded slowly. There is always a chance. The main thing is not to miss it. Over the next few weeks, John and the young man, whose name turned out to be Marcus, began to form a strange but strong partnership. John helped him get a job through old contacts and gave him contacts to an organization that supported young people from poor neighborhoods. Marcus was initially skeptical of his chances, but seeing John's persistence, he began to try. He felt that this might be his last chance to get out. But that was just the beginning. Marcus had serious challenges ahead. He was treated with suspicion at work. His friends in his home neighborhood considered him a traitor because he had started living differently. And although John was there, supporting him in difficult moments, Marcus still felt pressure from all sides. Several months passed. John and Marcus began to develop a kind of mentoring relationship. John saw the young man gradually change. His movements became more confident, his eyes more focused, and he no longer had the wild desperation with which they had met that night at the ATM. It seemed that Marcus had overcome the initial difficulties, and he finally had a chance at a different life. However, it turned out to be more complicated than John had expected. One evening, when they were sitting together in a small cafe on the street corner, discussing Marcus's plans for the future, the young man looked tense and worried. John, always observant, noticed this immediately. Is something wrong? He asked, putting down his coffee cup and looking closely at Marcus. Marcus sighed and looked around nervously. as if he was afraid that someone would overhear their conversation. "John, I don't know what to do," he began. Everything we've talked about is important, but there's one thing I can't shake off. I'm in debt, seriously in debt. The guys I used to hang out with, they found out I started a new life, and now they want me to pay them back." John frowned. This was an unexpected turn of events. He knew that such things happened in poor areas, where people were often under the influence of criminal gangs, but he hoped that Marcus could avoid this trap. "What do they want?" John asked cautiously. Marcus rubbed his hands nervously, his gaze darting around like a cornered animal. "Money. Lots of money. I can't pay it back." I tried to talk to them, to explain that things had changed for me, that I wasn't playing these games anymore, but they weren't interested in words. They said that if I didn't pay them back. Marcus trailed off, as if he couldn't continue. "What did they say?" John leaned closer, feeling the tension build. "They threatened my family," Marcus managed to say. "My sister, she's still sick, and they know it. They said if I didn't bring them money, they'd do something terrible." "John, I don't know what to do. I don't have that kind of money, and going to the police would be signing my own death warrant. You know how it works." John froze for a moment. He realized that the situation was more serious than either of them had realized. He knew the rules of the streets, and he knew that there were no easy solutions to these matters. Leaving things as they were would put Marcus and his family's lives in danger. "How much are they asking for?" John asked, trying not to show his concern. Marcus exhaled, as if he was ashamed to say it out loud. $5,000. John was surprised. The amount was significant, especially for a young guy like Marcus, who was just starting to rebuild his life. But the scariest thing was that the people demanding money would obviously not stop at threats. They were used to violence. "I don't have that kind of money, Marcus, but maybe there's another way." John narrowed his eyes, considering his options. "Who are these people? What clan do they belong to?" "They're locals," Marcus replied. "They control several areas of the city. You can't mess with them." John knew people like that. They weren't just crime bosses, they raised generation after generation of young men in fear and submission. He realized that one of the reasons so many people couldn't escape poverty and violence was not just the system, but also groups like that exploited people's weaknesses, kept them in fear and dependence. John thought for a moment and then said quietly, "I knew people like that many years ago, and you know what? They always think they are stronger than others, that they can dictate their rules. But the truth is, they are all cowards. They only hold on to fear. If someone stops being afraid of them, their power will disappear. I think we need to let them know that you are no longer afraid of them." Marcus looked at John with doubt and bewilderment. "Are you suggesting that I go to them and tell them that I'm not afraid? Are you serious? They'll kill me." "No." John shook his head. "We have to show them that you're not alone. They have to understand that if they attack you, they're up against more than just a scared guy." "And how are we going to do that?" Marcus looked at him with disbelief. John thought for a moment and then said, "I have old friends, people who fought for rights and against violence many years ago. These people know how to organize something bigger than a street fight. We can attract public attention. We will make sure that the whole neighborhood, the whole city knows that you are no longer in their power. If they try something, it will become public." Marcus froze, realizing the enormity of John's proposal. "Do you really think this will work?" he asked. "Yes," John said, gritting his teeth, "but only if you're willing to fight for your life. It won't be easy. We'll attract attention, and that might make them even angrier, but they can't act openly if the entire neighborhood is on our side. We need to organize a rally, get the press involved. We'll make them afraid of you, not the other way around." The next morning, John took action. He called his old contacts, people who had spent decades fighting for black rights and against violence. They began organizing a rally, a public meeting in support of Marcus, with local media speaking out. The idea was simple, to show that Marcus was not alone, that he had the support of his community, and that if anything happened to him, the consequences would be severe for those who had tried to intimidate him. Everything went according to plan, but on the day of the rally, something unexpected happened. When John and Marcus arrived at the scene, they were met with a scene of chaos. Not only activists had gathered in the square, but also members of the very gang that had threatened Marcus. There were about 10 of them, and they had not come to silently observe the rally. One of the gang leaders, a tall man with tattoos on his neck, stepped forward. Approaching John and Marcus, the crowd fell silent, and journalists began filming the scene. "You think you can hide this kid from us, old man?" His voice was cold and menacing. "You're meddling in something that's none of your business." Marcus turned pale, but John stood his ground, looking straight into the eyes of the gang leader. "This guy is no longer yours," John replied calmly. "He has decided to change his life, and if you touch him, you will face the consequences." The crowd began to buzz. People began to discuss what would happen next. The gang leader chuckled and, without taking his eyes off John, said, "Consequences? We're used to consequences. But you," he moved closer to John, "you don't even know what's going to happen next. We can destroy not only him, but you too. Don't forget who you're talking to, old man." John froze. The seconds dragged on like an eternity. He knew he was on the edge. Another moment, and everything could end in tragedy. But at that moment, Marcus took a step forward. "No," he said, gathering all his courage. "I'm not afraid of you, and you won't get a penny from me." The crowd began to roar again. Journalists managed to record the moment that could have changed everything. Marcus stood before the crowd, looking the gang leader straight in the eye. It seemed as if his words hung in the air, like a smoldering coal about to burst into flame. Everyone around him froze in anticipation. John, the people gathered in the square, even those who had just threatened Marcus. The gang leader's eyes flashed with rage, but behind it there was a hint of unexpected surprise. "So you've decided to become a hero, huh?" the leader hissed, approaching Marcus. "You think a few words will change your destiny?" Marcus took a deep breath, but there was no fear in his eyes, only determination. "I will no longer live in fear." His voice shook, but grew stronger with each word. "You have taken too much from me, my future, my freedom, my hope, but I will not let you control my life anymore." The gang leader chuckled as he looked back at his men, but his laughter was bitter. "You think anyone in this town cares about you?" he continued. "You're a black kid from a dirty neighborhood, just like the rest of us. You can say all these nice words, but in the eyes of the world, we're nothing. You think these people who stand behind you will stick around until the end? They'll disappear the moment the real danger starts to show." Marcus was silent. The leader took a step back, spread his arms and addressed the crowd. "It's all a show. All your rallies, posters, calls for justice, it's an illusion. The world will always look at us as dirt, because we were born in poverty, because we are black. No matter how hard we try, we will always be pushed into the background, used when it is profitable, and thrown away as soon as we become unnecessary." The words echoed through the crowd. They held not just anger, but the deep, searing pain that so many had felt for decades. The gang leader's words, despite his criminal actions, spoke to a truth many were afraid to voice. Society had conditioned people to view them as invisible. To the system, they were just statistics. John, listening to all this, felt a fire burning in his chest. He walked up to Marcus and stood next to him, addressing the gang leader directly. "You're right, the world often turns a blind eye to us," John began, his voice low but full of strength. "But that doesn't mean we have to accept it. Yes, we were born into poverty. Yes, we were discriminated against because of the color of our skin. But that's no reason to continue living in this hell you're trying to create." The gang leader looked at John in surprise, not expecting to hear such words. The crowd began to whisper, realizing that they were witnessing something more than just a conflict between Marcus and his oppressors. This was a challenge to the entire system, the entire structure of oppression that had existed for decades. "You say the world looks at us like dirt," John continued, "but you know what you're wrong about? We give the world the power to think of us as nothing. We believe it when we continue to live by the rules they force upon us. You could have been more than just a gang leader. You had a choice, but you chose the path of fear and violence." The leader narrowed his eyes, flaring his nostrils. He didn't like being put in his place, especially in front of a crowd. "You don't know what I've been through, old man," he hissed, his voice growing more menacing. "You don't know what it's like to lose everything and feel like trash every day. I survived here because I learned one thing: strength is all that matters. John nodded, his eyes shining with tension. Strength, yes, strength matters, but real strength is not about threatening people or keeping them in fear. Real strength is when you choose not to destroy, but to build. When you go against the system, not by becoming part of it, but by fighting it from within. Do you think you're strong because you can intimidate people? But in reality, you're just a slave. You're a slave to the system, just like everyone else. The crowd froze. The words came like a bolt from the blue. The gang leader visibly tensed. His eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. John continued, his voice as hard as steel. I've seen strong men die because they couldn't find another way, and I've seen them break when they realize their strength is just an illusion. You think you own this street, you control these people, but in reality, you've lost control of your own life. Marcus, who had been listening silently all this time, felt his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that it wasn't just his future that was at stake here, but the futures of many around him. This wasn't just a gang conflict, it was a challenge to an entire structure of oppression that had been destroying hope for a better future for people like him for generations. At that moment, an unexpected voice was heard in the crowd. He's right, we all live in fear, and it's killing us. Marcus turned to see an elderly woman standing in the crowd. Her face was drawn, but her eyes were determined. I've lived in this area my whole life, she continued, and every day I see our children dying, not just physically, but spiritually. They're taken by these gangs and they never come back. We can't stay silent any longer. Her words echoed through the crowd. Others began to speak up, supporting her. Some recalled their lost children. Others told stories of how they themselves had been drawn into the criminal world but had managed to escape. The gang leader began to get nervous. The situation was getting out of his control. You all forget who is in power here, he shouted, trying to regain his influence. This is all temporary. You will return to me again when you understand that you have no other choice. But John stepped forward and said the last, most powerful thing. No, we will not go back. We will not live in fear anymore. You and your kind have kept this area in the shadows for too long, but now we decide for ourselves how to live. There was silence for a few seconds. Then, as if on cue, the crowd began to applaud. It wasn't just a gesture of support, it was an act of liberation. People who had lived in the shadows their entire lives were beginning to realize that they had a voice, a right to fight for their future. The gang leader knew the moment was lost. He glared at Marcus and John, then waved at his men and walked away, disappearing into the alleys. But this time, his exit was not triumphant, but shameful. He had lost his power, not because someone had intimidated him, but because people no longer feared him. After the gang left, the crowd began to disperse, but people continued to discuss what had happened. John and Marcus stood silently, realizing that they had witnessed something more than just a run-in with criminals. This was the first step toward change. You were right, Marcus said quietly, looking at John. This isn't just a fight for money or power. This is a fight for the future. John nodded, his face serious but his eyes shining with pride. We've only just begun, he replied, but now you know what it means to be strong, not the kind that keeps others in fear, but the kind that is not afraid to move forward, no matter what. The sun was setting behind the horizon, bathing the city streets in golden light. The moment seemed to symbolize not only the end of the day, but also the beginning of a new era for many in the area. John and Marcus stood on the corner, surrounded by people who had once been silent witnesses to fear and violence, but now felt a new strength and hope within them. But beyond the rally, in the dark alleys, the fate of Marcus and John still hung in the balance. The gang leader, hurt and humiliated, returned to his men determined to reassert his influence and punish those who dared to challenge him. The next morning, news reports about the rally began to surface. Journalists raised questions about violence, racism, and the systemic problems that continued to plague the city. But not all the news was positive. Criminal gangs had become more violent. Over the next week, gang members were spotted roaming the streets in several neighborhoods, causing unrest and intimidating locals. This time the threat was real. John and Marcus were one step away from organizing another meeting when a woman from their neighborhood approached them, a worried look on her face. I heard they were going to do something terrible, she whispered, her voice shaking with fear. They're looking for you, Marcus. They say you dared to defy them. Marcus paled. He knew they weren't going to stop just like that. What had started as a simple claim had turned into a full-blown war. John put his arm around his shoulders, trying to steady him. We can't run from this, he said, looking into Marcus' eyes. We have to act before it's too late. At that moment, another acquaintance approached them, a young guy named Rick, who had always been on the side of the street but had no way to escape the vicious cycle of violence. He looked worried, and his voice was shaking. I heard they were coming here, Rick said. They said you two should pay for what you did. I don't want you killed, but I don't want to die either. John and Marcus looked at each other. They knew they had to do something quickly to protect themselves and others. They couldn't let fear take over the people again and put them at the mercy of these bandits again. John gathered all his contacts and some activists he knew from previous rights fights. They began to formulate a plan. This time, they decided to appeal to the general public to create a united front against violence. At the meeting, they discussed how to attract media attention and force local authorities to pay attention to the problem. If we can gather more people, it will give us strength, said one activist. We have to show that we are united. We have the right to live safely. But we have to do it carefully, John added. We can't let them silence us or intimidate us. We have to be smart about it. Marcus, feeling like an important part of this movement, stood up and said, I'm ready to talk. I'm ready to tell my story. I want people to know what I've been through and why I'm not afraid anymore. I want them to understand that this isn't just my problem, it's all of us. The crowd agreed, and they began to prepare a rally to which local residents, activists, and journalists were invited. They decided to hold the event in the very center of the area to attract maximum attention. On the day of the rally, everything seemed tense. People were starting to gather, but the tension was palpable. With each passing minute, John felt the fear and excitement growing as familiar faces approached. Their support was palpable, but there was a fear in the air that the gang might try to stop the rally. People started taking to the streets. Banners with slogans about the right to safety and against violence went up in the air. Soon the crowd grew to several hundred people. Many of them did not just come to support Marcus, they came to tell their stories, to share their fears and hopes for a better future. When it was time to perform, Marcus walked out on stage. His heart was pounding, but he knew he couldn't back down. He saw familiar faces in the crowd and realized this wasn't just his fight, it was the entire community's. I stand here not only for myself, he began, his voice loud and confident. I stand here for all who suffer violence and fear. I stand here for those who have been lost, for those who have no voice. His words were met with thunderous applause. He continued, yes, we are black. Yes, we grew up poor, but that does not determine our destiny. We can be anyone. We can change our lives if we stand together. We should not be afraid to rise up against oppression. But at that moment, screams were heard from the crowd. People began to panic. John and Marcus turned around and saw a group of men, including those same gang members. They came close. Their intentions were clear. What kind of circus is this? One of them shouted. You, a black man, are going to be a target? You think you can just challenge us? We won't let you get away with this. The whole crowd froze. People's hearts sank with fear. But Marcus, gathering his strength, said loudly, we are not afraid of you. We stand together, and no one can silence us. The men of the gang came closer, their faces full of rage. John stood next to Marcus, his hands clenched into fists. These aren't just words, he shouted. This is a movement. You can't just come and take this away from us. We're going to fight to the end. One of the bandits, the same leader who had once threatened Marcus, stepped forward and said with fury, we will make you pay for your words. We will take what is yours, and we will do it with ease. The crowd began to shift back, but Marcus and John stood their ground, not retreating. There was a tense silence in the air, and it seemed as if the whole situation could turn violent at any moment. But it was at this moment that something unexpected happened. An elderly woman, the same one who had spoken at the first rally, stepped forward, her face full of determination. This isn't just your fight, she said loudly, her voice full of power. This is our fight, and we won't sit back and watch you bully us. Other older people came out with her, and then some young people. They stood next to Marcus and John, creating a powerful front against the gang. It was true unity. The gang leader, seeing this, became furious. "You think this will all end peacefully? You don't understand what we can do to you," he shouted, his voice breaking with rage. But the crowd didn't waver. Instead, they began chanting, "No fear, we are together. No fear, we are together." The chant, which began as a quiet whisper, gradually grew in volume, turning into a powerful cry that echoed off the walls around them. People stood shoulder to shoulder, and their resolve was unwavering. Soon the police arrived on the scene. Their cars pierced the silence and they got out, ready to assess the situation. The bandits, realizing that the situation was getting out of control, began to retreat. "Get out," one of the policemen shouted, pointing a flashlight at the bandits. "We will not tolerate any acts of violence." This was a turning point. People in the crowd started raising their hands, shouting that they did not want violence, but they wanted justice. They wanted their voices to be heard, so that they would no longer live in fear. As the gang disappeared into the darkness, the crowd filled the square with cheers. It was a moment of triumph, but the knowledge that the fight was not over hung over them. "We did it," Marcus whispered, his heart pounding with excitement. John nodded, his eyes shining. "Yes, but this is just the beginning. We must keep talking, keep fighting. This movement is not just a moment, it must be our life." That evening, as the sun sank below the horizon, a new beginning loomed on the path to change. People were full of hope and determination, ready to continue fighting for their rights, for justice, and for their lives. They now knew that they could change their circumstances when they acted together. From that day on, every time they gathered for rallies, it was not just about fighting crime. It covered many topics: education, employment, health services, and, above all, human rights. Their voices grew louder, and they understood that each of them mattered. Each step they took brought them closer to freedom and justice. Marcus and John began training young people to organize events, raise awareness of issues in their neighborhoods, and create a sustainable support system for those in need. They opened a center where people could come, discuss their problems, and find support. The gang leader was just a shadow in their memory. They now realized that true strength was not in intimidation, but in unity and mutual support. Every day they continued to rise, and despite all the difficulties, they hoped that one day their efforts would lead to change not only in their neighborhood, but in the entire city. And that was just the beginning. Their fight for justice, for human rights, and against racism continued, strengthening their community and bringing hope to those who once thought they were lost. Now they knew, together, they could change the world. A few weeks after the successful rally, when John and Marcus felt more confident, tensions in their neighborhood were only growing. The gangsters, although retreated, did not abandon their intentions, and meanwhile racial prejudice continued to permeate people's daily lives. It all started with small things: random insults on the street, threats of violence, and the constant feeling that someone was watching their every move. John and Marcus decided they couldn't just sit back and do nothing. They began holding regular meetings, trying to build support and unity in their community, but internal strife and discord became increasingly palpable. At one such meeting, attended by about 30 people, a lively discussion broke out. One of the participants, a young activist named Kevin, stood up and said, "We must be more aggressive. They do not understand our pain, and we must show them that we will not remain silent." But a different point of view was expressed by an elderly woman who came to the meeting. "No, we must act wisely. We cannot become what they are. We must show them that we can be strong, but without violence." The argument escalated and soon the room became hostile. Marcus stood up and, trying to calm the crowd down, said, "We are all here because we want change, but if we start fighting with each other, we will lose everything we have built." The crowd quieted down, but the tension remained. People began to discuss how to combine their efforts to be more effective. A few days after the meeting, when they were planning another big event, something terrible happened. The next morning, when Marcus left his house, he noticed that his car was damaged, the windows were broken, and the paint was ruined. The shock took his breath away. He quickly called John, who came to see the damage. "This isn't just an accident," John said, examining the car. "This is a warning. They want to scare you." Marcus felt a chill in his chest. He knew this could mean the gang was going back to their threats. "We should call the police," John suggested, but Marcus shook his head. "I don't think it will help. They never took our side. We have to show that we are strong and that this will not break us." They decided to organize a meeting with the activists to discuss how to proceed. At the meeting, they told them what had happened. "That means they're afraid of us," Kevin said, clenching his fists. "We have to keep fighting." But the old woman intervened again. "Whether they are afraid of us or not is not important. We must show that we do not want violence. We must not give up our principles." Meanwhile, the gang leader, who felt threatened by the resurgent community, took action. He gathered his men and called for tough measures. "We can't let them think they can just change our neighborhood," he shouted at the meeting. "We have to remind them who's boss here." Thugs began patrolling the streets, threatening those who dared to express their opinions. An atmosphere of fear was created, and people, seeing their neighbors being intimidated, began to stay in the shadows, which made the situation even worse. The next morning, John and Marcus learned of an attack on a local activist who had dared to speak out against the bandits. He had been severely beaten and was in critical condition. This shocked the community. "We have to act," John said, his voice full of determination. "If we don't show that we are united, we won't be able to stop this violence." They decided to organize another rally, this time against violence and threats, but they knew that this time the gang would most likely not leave them alone. On the day of the rally, many people came to the center of the district. People brought posters with slogans, but many were filled with anxiety. As soon as Marcus went on stage, he saw familiar faces and felt that their support was stronger than ever. "We are here to show that fear will not stop us," he began. "We are here to defend our right to live without violence, without threats." The crowd applauded wildly, but the tension in the air was palpable. John stood next to Marcus and continued, "As difficult as it may be, we must remember that we are not alone. This is a fight not only for us, but also for the future of our children." But their words were interrupted by shouts from the edge of the square. The gang leader had appeared with several of his followers, and he was not going to leave. "What's going on here?" he shouted, his voice full of rage. "You think you can just challenge us like that?" People began to worry, but Marcus, not wanting to back down, replied, "We are not afraid of you. We stand for our rights, for our lives, and no one can stop us." The gang leader began to walk up to the stage, his thugs following him. This was the decisive moment. The crowd froze, waiting to see what would happen next. But at that moment, the elderly woman stepped forward again. "This is not the path we have chosen," she said, her voice confident. "We do not want violence. We want peace." But the bandits weren't going to listen. One of them, frightened by the scale of the rally, moved towards Marcus. There was a loud sound, a shot. The crowd screamed and people began to run away. Marcus, who had only momentarily felt that he might be killed, did not know what to do. But suddenly the sound of sirens was heard. The police, responding to reports of a rally, arrived at the scene. The bandits, seeing that they had nowhere to run, began to panic. "Get out!" one of the policemen shouted, his voice loud and confident. "We will not tolerate violence." At this point, despite the fear and tension, the crowd began to come together, showing that they were united and would not allow the bandits to intimidate them. After the police dispersed the bandits, life in the area returned to normal, but the wounds remained open. People began to gather in meetings to discuss how to continue moving forward, how to cope with the aftermath, and how to support each other during this difficult time. Marcus and John knew that despite all the challenges, they couldn't let fear get the better of them. They began organizing more rallies, where they talked about the importance of unity, education, and maintaining a positive atmosphere. Still, anger and frustration remained. People continued to discuss how to deal with the systemic racism and hostility that still permeated their lives. Their shared goal of making a difference became more urgent. Over time, Marcus and John's activism began to bear fruit. They formed connections with other activists across the city, began running educational programs, and created resources to support people who had suffered violence and bias. They saw their efforts change the lives of local residents, as people began to talk about their fears and share their stories. But that was just the beginning. Internal conflicts and biases still existed, and they knew they had a lot of work to do. One day, when they were having another meeting, Marcus noticed a woman sitting quietly in the corner, with sadness on her face. He approached her. "What happened?" he asked, feeling her pain. "I'm just tired," she replied, "tired of being afraid, of having to fight for our rights every day." Marcus nodded, understanding her feelings, but he also knew that even in the most difficult times, it was important to maintain hope and faith in change. "We're all tired," he said, "but if we stick together, we can create a world where fear doesn't control our lives." This conversation reminded him of why they had started this journey. He knew that even if the path was difficult, he was not alone. There was a real struggle ahead, but they were ready for it. Each step brought them closer to changing not only their lives, but the lives of many others. Despite Marcus and John's efforts, prejudice and fear continued to cloud the atmosphere in the area. With each passing day, alarming reports of attacks and threats came in, and the tension in the air grew more palpable. The gang, though weakened, was still at large, and its members had become even more violent. One evening, as Marcus was returning from yet another meeting, he noticed several strangers standing outside his house. Their looks were full of contempt and malice. His heart began to beat faster. He felt that something was brewing. As he approached, one of the men approached him, blocking his path. "You still think you can change anything here, black man?" he said with disdain. Marcus, having collected his thoughts, replied, "I am fighting for my right and the right of all of us. We will not allow you to intimidate us." But the strangers only laughed, and without waiting for an answer, they walked around him and disappeared into the darkness. Marcus felt a chill pierce his soul. He knew that the threat had become even more real. The next day, the atmosphere at the activist meeting was tense. Tension filled the room as they discussed how to proceed. Some participants began to express dissatisfaction, believing that Marcus and John's actions were leading them to disaster. "We're risking everything," one member exclaimed. "Maybe it's time to think about just leaving this place." Marcus jumped to his feet. "Run away? And what will we leave behind? This is our home. We cannot give in when they try to break us." But soon more drama erupted. Several young men burst through the door, looking scared. They said that one of the activists, Kevin, had been brutally beaten on the street while returning home. "He's in the hospital now," the girl said, her voice shaking. They said if any of us tried to do anything, they'd come back. The news shocked everyone. Sadness and anger filled the room, and a noisy argument broke out about what to do next. However, amidst all the panic, Marcus noticed someone standing outside the door. It was an older woman they knew as Mary. She was not an activist, but she had always supported them. Now her face was serious. "I can help you," she said. "I have contacts in the police who are ready to support your movement, but we need to act quickly." Marcus and John looked at each other. They knew they had to find allies, and although they had doubts about the police, this was their chance. "Okay," Marcus agreed, "but we have to be careful." While they were discussing the details, the sound of sirens could be heard outside the window. Police cars stopped right outside the building. Mary went out to talk to the police, while Marcus and John decided to stay with the participants. They discussed how to use this situation to their advantage. "We have to prepare ourselves for the possibility that we might need defenders," John said. "If the police are really interested in helping, we have to use it." When Mary returned, she confirmed that the police were willing to help, but only if they acted calmly and did not provoke violence. "We need to gather evidence," she added. "We need witnesses and all the facts." They decided to organize a meeting with local residents to gather information about attacks and threats. This would give them the opportunity to demonstrate that their community was suffering and that it needed protection and justice. But the morning after the meeting, when Marcus left his house, he was met with terrible news. Rumors were spreading throughout the neighborhood that the gang was planning revenge. frightened locals began to leave, and this was another blow to the community. Marcus and John immediately gathered with the activists to discuss how to proceed. At that point, they decided to hold another protest, but this time with police support. They gathered people and went out into the streets, holding posters with slogans about peace and justice. But as they began their march, bandits' cars drove around the corner and screams began. "They're here!" one woman screamed, and chaos reigned in the air. Marcus, sensing that the situation was getting out of control, tried to calm the crowd. "People, stay together. Don't let fear take over." But the bandits started attacking and a real fight started in front of everyone. The police tried to intervene, but there weren't enough of them and it became a real fight for survival. In the chaos, as people ran in all directions, Marcus saw Kevin, still in a cast from the previous attack, being grabbed by a bandit. His heart sank in terror. He couldn't let his friend get hurt again. "Leave him alone," he shouted, rushing towards Kevin. But at that moment, the bandit hit Kevin in the face, and he fell to the ground. Marcus, filled with anger, rushed forward, and at that moment several bandits surrounded him. "No need," John shouted, but it was too late. Marcus found himself surrounded, and he knew that if he didn't stop this violence now, it could turn into something terrible. He began to fight, but his strength was waning. The fight was unfolding around him, and he felt himself losing control. But suddenly the sound of sirens was heard. The police arrived on the scene, and their numbers increased. This forced the bandits to retreat, but tensions remained high. After the situation calmed down, people began to gather to see what had happened. At this point, one of the local activists who had always supported Marcus and John stepped forward. "We must continue our fight," he said, but his voice sounded strange. "How could you?" one of the activists shouted. "You were with us." But now they realized that this man was in cahoots with the gang. He was trying to undermine their efforts from within. His actions were part of a plan to split their community and bring it back under gang control. "You betrayed us," Marcus screamed. "We trusted you." "We must be realistic," the traitor replied. "You will never win. I just don't want to get killed." It was a shock to everyone. People began to realize that there were traitors in their own circle, and this undermined their unity. But despite the disappointment and betrayal, Marcus and John knew they had to gather their strength. They decided to continue their fight to prevent bandits and traitors from destroying their dream of justice. They began to work more actively with the police and organize additional rallies, attracting more and more people, showing that even in the darkest times they are not alone. A new wave of activism began in their community. People began sharing their stories, telling of the prejudices and violence they had faced. And although many were still scared, they began to understand that only together could they change their fate. Marcus and John, realizing the importance of their fight, started a new campaign. They decided to create a support program for those who had become victims of violence. In their project, they offered help not only to victims, but also to those who wanted to become activists. Every day more and more people joined their movement. At the next rally, which attracted several hundred people, the atmosphere was full of energy and determination. Marcus walked onto the stage, his heart pounding with excitement, but he felt the support of the entire community. The crowd waited for him to speak. "We stand here today," he began, "not only for ourselves, but also for those who cannot speak, for those who have been victims of violence, racism and prejudice. We are here to show that we are united and will not allow anyone to divide us." People applauded wildly, their voices merging into a single chorus. Everyone felt that this was their moment, their chance to make the world a better place. "But this is not just a fight for us," he continued. "This is a fight for the future of our children. They must grow up in a world where there is no fear and hatred." At that moment, he noticed a woman standing in the background holding a sign that read, "Justice for Kevin." It reminded him that their struggle was real and the effects of the violence affected each of them. After the rally, Marcus and John organized a working group of activists, lawyers, and psychologists to create a safe space for victims of violence. They began holding training sessions, teaching people how to protect themselves and their rights, as well as how to seek help. Although these classes attracted many new participants, discontent among some people continued to grow. Some felt that the movement was becoming too peaceful and that violence should be addressed aggressively. At one of the meetings, one of the activists named Tracy stood up and said, "We can talk about peace, but what to do with these bandits? They won't stop until they feel our strength." Marcus, reacting to her words, said, "Yes, we can be strong, but strength should not always be expressed in violence. We must be smarter. We need allies, not enemies." However, their discussion did not calm the heated passions. Splits began to appear in the group, and this became another challenge for Marcus and John. Soon came the terrible news. Kevin, while in the hospital, succumbed to his injuries. This shook the community to its core. Hundreds of people attended his funeral, and Marcus gave a moving speech. "We have lost not only a friend, but also a symbol of our struggle," he said. "Kevin dreamed of a just world. We cannot allow his memory to be forgotten." Tears streamed down many cheeks. People began discussing how to honor his memory and make his tragic story a catalyst for change. That's when Kevin's older sister, Ava, stepped forward. "I want you to keep fighting," she said, her voice shaking with grief. "But do it right. Don't let hate take over." It was emotional. She called on everyone to come together to create a program to help victims of violence that would help others avoid the same fate as her brother. Marcus and John took it upon themselves to make this idea a reality. They began raising funds and organizing events where stories could be shared, informative talks given, and awareness raised about racism and violence. But there was a new threat on the horizon. The gang, feeling pressure from the growing movement, began to intensify their efforts to intimidate people and bring them back into fear. They began attacking activists, setting cars on fire, and writing threatening messages on the walls of buildings. Marcus and John knew they had to respond, but how? The answer wasn't obvious. They began working with local media to raise awareness. That led to their story being featured on television. In a live interview, Marcus spoke about their struggle and how they plan to continue the movement for justice. He spoke about the importance of unity and how fear should not stop them. "We will not be silent," he said with feeling. "We will not let hate control our lives. This is our neighborhood, and we will fight for it." Marcus' words resonated with many viewers, and soon their movement became more widely known. People began to gather at their rallies and offer help. This gave the activists new hope and strength. Soon after they gained widespread support, several groups from different communities who had also suffered violence and racism began reaching out. They offered to join forces. It was an unexpected turn of events. The meeting with them was full of energy and determination. Representatives of different communities spoke about their experiences and the importance of uniting to combat systemic problems. At one meeting, among the participants was a local businessman, a white man named Tom, who seemed genuinely interested in making a difference. "I understand that my experience is different from yours, but I want to be an ally in your fight," he said. "I am willing to use my resources and connections to help you make change." This caused a storm of emotions in the room. Some activists were skeptical, but many saw this as a chance to build bridges. The next step was to create a coalition that brought together different communities. This allowed them to hold larger events, attract attention and resources. They began organizing information campaigns, holding seminars and trainings to raise awareness about racism and violence. However, despite all efforts, the gang did not give up their intentions. They continued to threaten activists, and the situation remained tense. One of the latest incidents occurred when one of the coalition members was beaten in the street while returning from an event. This was the catalyst. The entire city was frozen in fear again, and the activists knew they had to act decisively. Marcus called everyone to a meeting. "We can't let them continue to bully us," he said. "This is no longer just our fight. This is a fight for the future of all of us." The crowd cheered his words, and the activists decided to organize a mass protest that would not only express their anger, but also bring people together to show that they were united. On the day of the action, the entire area was full. Thousands of people gathered, holding posters with slogans about peace and justice. People from different communities came out to show their solidarity. However, at this point the gang that had seemed to have gone quiet again came back into power. Shouts could be heard as a group of thugs tried to push through the crowd to create chaos and intimidate the activists. But Marcus, seeing this happening, came out on stage and shouted, "People, stay together, we can't let them divide us." His words, full of determination, acted as a calming agent. People began to unite, forming a chain of arms, protecting each other. Soon the police were on the scene, ready to intervene, but this was no longer necessary. The community had become united, and even betrayal could no longer break it. The protest was over, but their fight was just beginning. People realized that they could only confront violence, racism, and prejudice by uniting. They began working on a bill that would protect their rights and provide support for victims of violence. At a meeting about the project, Marcus recalled Kevin's words. He said, "Kevin dreamed of a just world. We must make sure that his dream lives on. This is not just our fight, it is our duty." The warmth and love they felt for each other became a source of strength that no force of hatred could tear apart. Eventually, their efforts began to bear fruit. The bill they had drafted was passed by the local council. It was a historic moment for their community, but more importantly, it was proof that they could make a difference if they worked together. The community began to change. People began to connect, learn from each other, and support each other. Together, they created a new center for helping victims of violence, which became a place where people could get the support and information they needed. Although the road to justice was still long, Marcus and John knew they were no longer alone. They were part of something bigger, and that unity became a powerful weapon in their fight against racism and violence. A few months later, a unity festival took place on the site of the violence. People from all over the city gathered to celebrate their achievements and strengthen their bonds. On stage, Marcus performed again. Now his voice sounded confident and powerful. "We did it together," he said, "and although we will face new challenges, we know that together we can overcome everything. Each of us is a step towards justice." The crowd erupted in applause. This was more than just a celebration. It was an affirmation of their strength, their hope, and their future. The sun was slowly setting below the horizon, painting the sky in orange and pink tones. The atmosphere at the Unity Festival was filled with joy and hope. People hugged each other, danced to the sounds of music, and every corner of the park was filled with laughter and conversation. It was a symbol of victory, victory over fear and hatred. Marcus stood on the stage and watched it all. He felt his heart swell with pride. He remembered how it all started, with attacks, threats, and fear. Now they stood as a united front, and their community was stronger than ever. John, his faithful friend and comrade, approached him. "We did it, Marcus. I never thought I'd live to see this day," he said, holding back tears of joy. "Yes, we did it together," Marcus replied, hugging him, "but this is just the beginning. We need to keep working to make our voices heard." The festival had a special area dedicated to Kevin. There was a large banner with his photo and the words, "In memory of Kevin, for justice and peace." People came up to leave notes, their memories of him and how his life had inspired them. Ava, Kevin's sister, stood in the area, surrounded by friends and supporters. She was smiling, but there was sadness in her eyes. "He was a true fighter," she said, turning to the assembled group. "Kevin dreamed of a world free of hate. Let's continue his work." The crowd burst into applause again, a reminder that they were not only fighting for themselves, but also for those who could no longer fight. At this time, Marcus and John were approached by representatives of different communities: white, black, Latino, and Asian. They all came together to show support. "We must learn from each other," said one of the representatives. "Hatred cannot divide us if we work together." Marcus nodded, a smile breaking out on his face. "That's what we do. We're not just speaking out against racism, we're creating a new culture of understanding and respect." The festival continued, and new speakers took to the stage. People shared their stories, their victories and defeats. Each voice added a new touch to the picture of the common cause, but no one forgot that the path to the final restoration of justice was still long. Marcus stepped up to the microphone to make his closing statement. "Today we celebrate, but tomorrow new work begins. We must continue to fight for change, for education, for the rights of those who suffer." The crowd thundered with applause again. Everyone was confident that they were on the right track. A few months after the festival, Marcus and John launched the Light in the Dark program, which helped disadvantaged children receive an education and find a safe space to communicate and develop. The project was made possible by the funds raised and the support of local businesses. Marcus often met with children, shared his stories and experiences with them. He talked about the importance of believing in yourself and fighting for your rights. He wanted them to know that they had a future, that they could change the world. Other cities joined their movement. The idea that they could create networks of support and unity spread like wildfire. It wasn't just a local initiative. It became a movement that swept the entire country. But they also faced new challenges. Gangs became more covert, and violence still existed, but people were now prepared to confront it. Society became more vigilant and organized. One day, as Marcus and John sat over coffee at a local coffee shop, they reflected on how far they had come. "Do you remember how it all started?" John asked. "Yes, and how full of fear we were," Marcus replied, "but we overcame it. We changed our lives and the lives of others." "This isn't the end," John said, looking out the window where the children were playing outside. "This is just the beginning." Marcus nodded, knowing that their work was not over and that they would continue to move forward despite the obstacles. Over time, they became symbols of hope and change, and even when new challenges arose, their community remained strong and united. They continued to hold rallies, educational programs, and actively work to improve the quality of life. Every year, they marked Kevin's Day of Remembrance, which became not just a day of mourning, but a day of celebrating unity, strength, and hope. They knew that each of them was part of something bigger, a movement that sought justice. The light in their hearts never went out. They knew that despite the difficulties, their fight was not over. They would fight for their children, for their friends, and for a future where there would be no room for hatred and prejudice. And in this unity lay their true strength. If you liked this story, please write in the comments what you think about it. Have you ever encountered racism in your life? It is important for us to hear your stories and opinions, because each of you is very valuable to us. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like it so you don't miss new inspiring stories. We appreciate each of you and wish you a wonderful day.